Have you ever wondered how one man's life could split history itself in two? How a carpenter's son from an obscure village could become the most influential figure who ever lived? The story I'm about to tell you is not just another religious tale. It's the account of a life so extraordinary that it fundamentally altered the course of human civilization, reshaping empires, toppling kingdoms, and igniting movements that continue to this very day. This is the complete life of Jesus Christ, and by the end of this series, you'll understand exactly why this single existence has captivated billions of people across 2,000 years. You'll discover the historical context that shaped his world, the radical nature of his message, and the explosive events that transformed a small Jewish sect into the world's largest religion. But more than that, you'll see how the ripple effects of this one life continue to influence politics, philosophy, art, science, and culture in ways you might never have imagined. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't just an ancient story locked away in dusty history books. The life of Jesus Christ is the most documented, debated, and dissected biography in human history. Scholars have spent centuries piecing together every detail, every cultural nuance, every political backdrop that shaped this remarkable narrative. What I'm about to share with you is the result of that exhaustive research, presented in a way that brings this ancient world to vivid life. Now, to truly grasp the magnitude of what we're dealing with, we need to start where every great story begins. Not with the birth, but with the world that was waiting for this extraordinary figure to arrive. Picture this. It's the 1st century in the land we now call Israel and Palestine. The Roman Empire stretches across 3 continents, ruling with an iron fist that has crushed every rebellion, absorbed every culture, and bent every nation to its will. Roman legions march on roads that span from Britain to Africa, carrying the message that resistance is futile and Caesar is Lord. But in this vast empire, there's one small stubborn province that refuses to be fully absorbed. The Jews of Palestine cling desperately to their ancient traditions, their mysterious God, and their unshakable belief that they are chosen people with a divine destiny. It's a powder keg waiting to explode, and into this volatile world steps a figure who will light the fuse that changes everything. The land itself tells a story of conflict and conquest. Jerusalem, the holy city, sits like a crown jewel on the Judean hills, its massive temple complex dominating the skyline. This isn't just a building, it's the beating heart of Jewish identity, the place where heaven touches earth, where sacrifices rise like incense to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Pilgrims journey from across the known world to worship here, bringing with them the hopes, dreams, and desperate prayers of a scattered people. But towering over even this sacred space is the Antonia fortress, a brutal reminder of who really holds power. Roman soldiers patrol its walls, their eagle standards a constant provocation to Jewish sensibilities. The message is clear. Your God may live in the temple, but Caesar rules the world. The political landscape is a chess game of competing interests and dangerous alliances. Herod the Great, the Roman-appointed king, has transformed the region with massive building projects, including the expansion of the temple into one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. But his reign is built on blood and paranoia. He's murdered his own sons, his wife, and countless others in his quest to maintain power. When he dies just a few years before our story truly begins, he leaves behind a fractured kingdom divided among his surviving sons, each more incompetent and brutal than the last. The religious establishment is equally complex and divided. The Pharisees, meticulous interpreters of the law, believe that strict adherence to traditional practices will bring about God's kingdom. The Sadducees, the aristocratic priestly class, collaborate with Rome to maintain their privileged position. The Essenes have retreated to the desert, convinced that the world is too corrupt to save. And lurking in the shadows are the zealots, Jewish revolutionaries who believe that violence is the only answer to foreign oppression. Into this cauldron of religious fervour, political tension, and social upheaval, ordinary people struggle to survive. Farmers work land they don't own, paying crushing taxes to both Rome and the Temple. Fishermen cast their nets in the Sea of Galilee, trying to feed their families while navigating the complex web of regulations and tribute demands. Craftsmen like carpenters and stonemasons find work in the endless construction projects that mark the Roman occupation, building the very structures that symbolize their oppression. But beneath all this visible turmoil runs something deeper, something that makes this moment in history unlike any other. The Jewish people are living in a state of intense expectation. Ancient prophecies speak of a coming deliverer, a Messiah who will restore the kingdom of David and usher in an age of peace and justice. Different groups have different ideas about what this figure will look like and what he will do, but the expectation is palpable, electric, dangerous. Some expect a military leader who will drive out the Romans with supernatural power. Others anticipate a priestly figure who will purify the temple and restore proper worship. Still others look for a prophet like Moses who will reveal new truths and lead the people to freedom. But almost everyone agrees on one thing: the current state of affairs cannot continue. Something has to give. Someone has to come. The religious calendar itself reflects this anticipation. Every festival, every ritual, every prayer service carries undertones of hope and longing. The Passover celebration recalls the great liberation from Egypt, but it also serves as a not-so-subtle reminder that God has freed his people before and can do so again. The Day of Atonement acknowledges the people's sins while pointing toward ultimate forgiveness and restoration. The Festival of Tabernacles commemorates God's provision in the wilderness while looking forward to a permanent dwelling place of peace. Trade routes crisscross this small but strategically crucial region, bringing news, ideas, and influences from across the empire. Greek philosophy mingles with Jewish theology in the synagogues. Roman engineering transforms the landscape with aqueducts and roads. Egyptian religious practices seep into popular culture. It's a melting pot of civilizations, all centered on this tiny strip of land that sits at the crossroads of 3 continents. The language situation alone reveals the complexity of this world. Hebrew remains the sacred language of scripture and formal worship, but it's largely a dead language for everyday communication. Aramaic has become the common tongue of ordinary Jewish people, the language of the marketplace and the home. Greek serves as the international language of commerce and education, essential for anyone who wants to engage with the broader Roman world. And Latin represents the language of power, the tongue of the occupying forces and the imperial administration. In the midst of all this complexity, we need to understand the profound spiritual hunger that characterizes this moment in history. This isn't just political oppression or economic hardship. This is a people who believe they have a covenant with the creator of the universe, who are convinced that their suffering has meaning, that their struggles are part of a larger divine plan that will ultimately vindicate their faith and establish justice on earth. The synagogue system that has developed during the centuries of exile serves as both a center of learning and a focal point for community resistance. In these modest buildings scattered throughout Palestine and across the Roman world, Jewish teachers interpret ancient texts, debate points of law, and keep alive the hope that God has not forgotten his promises. Every Sabbath service includes prayers for the restoration of the kingdom, for the coming of the Messiah, for the end of foreign domination. But this is also a world where the supernatural feels very close to everyday reality. Demons and angels are not abstract theological concepts, but active forces that people encounter in their daily lives. Miraculous healings, prophetic dreams, and divine interventions are expected parts of the religious landscape. When extraordinary events begin to unfold, people are primed to recognize them as signs that the long-awaited moment of deliverance may finally be at hand. The economic system creates its own set of tensions and expectations. The temple operates as both a religious institution and an economic powerhouse, employing thousands of workers and generating enormous wealth through the complex system of sacrifices, offerings, and pilgrim donations. But this wealth flows primarily to the priestly elite and their Roman patrons, while ordinary people struggle under the burden of religious taxes, imperial tribute, and the constant demands of survival in an occupied territory. Women in this society occupy a complex position, officially subordinate but often wielding significant influence within their families and communities. They cannot serve as witnesses in legal proceedings or participate fully in temple worship, yet they are the guardians of domestic religious observance and the primary educators of children in matters of faith and tradition. This tension between official marginalization and practical importance will become crucial as our story unfolds. Children grow up immersed in a culture of story and memory, learning the great narratives of their people through repetition and ritual. They memorize psalms and proverbs, participate in festivals and fasts, and absorb the deep conviction that they are part of something much larger than their individual lives. The past is not dead history, but living memory, and the future is not uncertain speculation, but promised destiny. This is the world, complex and contradictory, expectant and explosive, into which Jesus of Nazareth will be born. Every element we've explored, from the political tensions to the religious hopes, from the economic pressures to the cultural dynamics, will shape and be shaped by his extraordinary life. The stage is set for a drama that will unfold not just in Palestine, but across the entire Roman world and beyond. Understanding this context is absolutely crucial because it helps us grasp why the life of Jesus had the impact it did. This wasn't a peaceful, stable society ready to embrace new ideas. This was a pressure cooker of competing forces and conflicting hopes, and into this volatile mixture came a figure whose message and actions would prove to be more revolutionary than anyone could have imagined. The story begins not with fanfare or royal proclamation, but in the most unlikely of places. Nazareth was a village so insignificant that it barely registered on the maps of the ancient world. When one of Jesus' future disciples first heard where he was from, his reaction was telling. Can anything good come out of Nazareth? This wasn't just casual skepticism. Nazareth was the kind of place that ambitious young men left behind. Not the kind of place that produced world-changing figures. But sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary circumstances, and the circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth were about to shatter every expectation of how divine intervention was supposed to work. The Roman Empire had systems for everything, including population control and taxation. Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, had ordered a census that required every family to return to their ancestral homeland to be counted and taxed. For a young couple from Nazareth, this meant a difficult journey south to Bethlehem, the ancient city of King David. Joseph was a tekton, a Greek word that's often translated as carpenter, but actually refers to a general craftsman who worked with stone, wood, and metal. He wasn't wealthy, but he wasn't destitute either. In a society where most people lived at subsistence level, skilled craftsmen occupied a modest but respectable position in the social hierarchy. He was engaged to a young woman named Mary, probably in her early teens, as was customary for Jewish women of that era. What happened next would become one of the most celebrated and disputed events in human history. According to the Gospel accounts, Mary received a visit from an angel announcing that she would conceive and bear a son through divine intervention. In a culture where a woman's reputation and very survival depended on sexual purity before marriage, This announcement was potentially catastrophic. An unmarried pregnant woman could face social ostracism, economic ruin, or even death by stoning. Joseph's reaction reveals both the social dynamics of the time and his character. When he discovered Mary's pregnancy, his first instinct was to divorce her quietly, sparing her public shame while protecting his own reputation. But according to the narrative, he too received a divine message in a dream, instructing him to proceed with the marriage and accept the child as his own. This decision would have required tremendous courage and faith, as it meant taking on the social stigma and economic burden of raising another man's child, or in this case, what was claimed to be God's child. The journey to Bethlehem for the census would have been arduous under the best circumstances, but for a heavily pregnant woman, it was potentially dangerous. The road from Nazareth to Bethlehem wound through approximately 90 miles of difficult terrain, requiring several days of travel. They would have walked or possibly ridden a donkey, staying in roadside inns or camping under the stars, vulnerable to bandits, wild animals, and the elements. Bethlehem itself was overcrowded with census travelers, all seeking accommodation in a town that normally housed only a few hundred residents. The famous account of "no room in the inn" reflects not just personal inconvenience, but the broader reality of Roman administrative efficiency prioritizing bureaucratic compliance over human comfort. When Mary went into labor, the best shelter Joseph could find was likely a cave or stable attached to one of the town's modest dwellings. The birth itself occurred in conditions that would have been considered scandalous for anyone claiming royal lineage or divine favor. Ancient expectations of how gods revealed themselves to humanity typically involved displays of overwhelming power, magnificent palaces, and cosmic fanfare. Instead, the son who would be proclaimed as the Messiah entered the world in the same humble circumstances as countless peasant children throughout history. But the gospel narrative suggests that, while the earthly circumstances were humble, the heavenly response was anything but ordinary. The account describes a supernatural announcement to shepherds in nearby fields, complete with angelic choirs proclaiming peace on earth and goodwill toward humanity. Shepherds occupied one of the lowest positions in Jewish society, considered ritually unclean because of their constant contact with animals and their inability to observe all the religious requirements of temple worship. The choice to announce this birth first to shepherds, rather than to priests, kings, or scholars, was itself a revolutionary statement about the nature of the kingdom this child would establish. It suggested that God's favour was not reserved for the religiously elite or the socially prominent, but was offered first to those whom society had marginalised and forgotten. The traditional dating system that divides history into BC and AD places Jesus' birth at year 0, but historical evidence suggests he was actually born several years earlier, probably between 6 and 4 BC. This apparent contradiction results from a 6th century calculation error by a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, who was tasked with creating a Christian calendar system. By the time the error was discovered, the dating system had become too entrenched to change. The political implications of this birth were not lost on those in power. King Herod the Great, despite his advanced age and deteriorating mental state, remained paranoid about potential threats to his throne. When foreign dignitaries arrived in Jerusalem seeking the one who has been born King of the Jews, Herod's response was swift and brutal. These visitors, traditionally called the Magi or wise men, were likely Zoroastrian priests from Persia or Babylon, cultures with strong traditions of astronomical observation and messianic expectation. Their journey to Jerusalem seeking a newborn king created a diplomatic crisis that revealed both the international significance attributed to this birth and the deadly serious nature of messianic claims in a Roman-occupied territory. Herod's consultation with the Jewish religious authorities about messianic prophecies shows that these ancient predictions were not merely academic theological discussions, but live political issues with potentially explosive consequences. The Magi's gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh were not random selections but carried deep symbolic meaning. Gold represented royalty and kingship. Frankincense was associated with divinity and priestly function, and myrrh was used in burial preparations, hinting at the sacrificial death that would define this child's ultimate mission. These expensive gifts also provided the practical resources that would soon become necessary for the family's survival. Herod's massacre of the infants in Bethlehem, historically known as the slaughter of the innocents, reflects both the king's deteriorating psychological state in his final years and the broader pattern of violence that characterized his reign. While some historians question the scale of this event, given Bethlehem's small size, the account fits perfectly with Herod's documented paranoia and willingness to eliminate potential rivals, including members of his own family. The family's flight to Egypt represents one of history's great ironies. Egypt, the traditional symbol of oppression in Jewish memory, became the place of refuge for the child who would be proclaimed as the ultimate deliverer. This geographical detail also fulfilled ancient prophetic expectations while demonstrating how political circumstances could force even the most significant religious figures to become refugees in foreign lands. Their time in Egypt would have exposed the young Jesus to one of the most cosmopolitan cultures of the ancient world. Alexandria was a center of learning and commerce, home to the famous library and a thriving Jewish community that had already begun translating Hebrew scriptures into Greek. While the family probably lived modestly in one of Egypt's smaller Jewish enclaves, the cultural exposure would have provided an early glimpse of the broader world that this child would eventually impact. The return to Palestine after Herod's death in 4 BC required careful navigation of the new political landscape. Herod's kingdom had been divided among his 3 surviving sons, none of whom possessed their father's political acumen or administrative skill. Archelaus ruled Judea and Samaria with such brutality that Rome eventually removed him from power. Herod Antipas governed Galilee and Perea with more success but remained a constant threat to anyone with messianic pretensions. Philip ruled the largely Gentile territories east of the Jordan River with relative competence and moderation. Joseph's decision to settle in Nazareth rather than return to Bethlehem reflected both practical safety concerns and divine guidance according to the Gospel accounts. Galilee under Herod Antipas offered more religious freedom and economic opportunity than Judea under the direct rule of Roman prefects. The region's diverse population and distance from Jerusalem's religious establishment would provide a relatively safe environment for raising a child whose identity carried such dangerous political implications. The years of Jesus' childhood and adolescence remain largely hidden from historical view, covered by what scholars call the silent years. Only one significant episode from this period survives in the Gospel narratives, but it provides crucial insight into the developing consciousness of this remarkable figure and sets the stage for the revolutionary ministry that would soon transform the ancient world. The incident that breaks the silence of Jesus' early years occurs when he is 12 years old, the age when Jewish boys traditionally began preparing for their bar mitzvah and full participation in religious life. The setting is Jerusalem during Passover, the most significant festival in the Jewish calendar, when hundreds of thousands of pilgrims crowded into the holy city to commemorate their ancestors' liberation from Egyptian bondage. For a boy from rural Galilee, this first major journey to Jerusalem would have been overwhelming in its scope and significance. The city's population swelled to perhaps 10 times its normal size during festival periods, creating a carnival atmosphere of celebration, commerce, and religious fervour. Pilgrims camped in every available space, merchants hawked their wares in multiple languages, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation and devotion. The temple complex dominated not just the physical landscape, but the entire spiritual atmosphere of the festival. Herod's massive reconstruction project had transformed the modest post-exilic temple into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The outer courts buzzed with activity as money changers converted foreign currency for temple offerings and vendors sold the ritually pure animals required for sacrifice. The sound of thousands of lambs being slaughtered for the Passover meal, mixed with the chanting of priests and the prayers of worshippers from across the known world. For Jesus, this first encounter with the center of Jewish religious life seems to have triggered something profound in his developing consciousness. While his parents began the journey home with their traveling companions, assuming he was somewhere in the large group of Galilean pilgrims, Jesus remained behind in the temple courts. This wasn't mere childhood mischief or curiosity. Something in that sacred space had captured his attention in a way that transcended normal social expectations and family obligations. When Mary and Joseph discovered his absence after a full day of travel, their panic would have been immediate and overwhelming. A 12-year-old boy, alone in Jerusalem during the chaos following a major festival, faced dangers that ranged from simple starvation to kidnapping, slavery, or worse. The city's narrow streets and crowded quarters could easily swallow a child, and the dispersing crowds of pilgrims meant that any chance of finding him grew smaller with each passing hour. Their 3-day search finally led them back to the temple, where they found Jesus engaged in theological discussion with the religious teachers who remained in the city after the festival. This scene, often depicted in art as a precocious child amazing adults with his wisdom, actually reveals something far more significant about the nature of Jewish religious education and the unique character that was already emerging in this young person. The temple courts served as an informal but highly respected center of religious learning, where recognized scholars would gather to debate points of law, interpret scripture, and discuss theological questions. These sessions were not formal classes, but dynamic exchanges where ideas were tested through rigorous questioning and argument. For teachers to engage seriously with a 12-year-old boy suggests that his contributions to these discussions were far from ordinary childhood observations. The content of these conversations remains tantalizingly hidden from us, but their impact on the religious authorities was clearly profound. The Gospel account notes that all who heard Jesus were amazed at his understanding and his answers. This wasn't simply intellectual precocity, but a quality of insight that transcended his age and educational background. In a culture where religious authority was carefully guarded by those with proper credentials and extensive training, this young man from an insignificant Galilean village was demonstrating a grasp of a divine truth that confounded the experts. Mary's response when she finally found her son reveals the tension between normal parental concern and the growing awareness that this child was destined for something beyond ordinary family life. Her rebuke was natural and understandable, but Jesus' answer opens a window into his developing sense of identity and mission. His statement about being in his Father's house suggests an emerging consciousness of his unique relationship with God that would eventually reshape humanity's understanding of the divine nature. The years that followed this Jerusalem incident are once again shrouded in historical silence, but they were clearly years of preparation and development. Jesus returned to Nazareth and, according to the Gospel accounts, lived in submission to his parents while growing in wisdom, stature, and favour with both God and humanity. This period of hidden preparation lasted until he was approximately 30 years old, making it one of the longest apprenticeships in recorded history. Nazareth during these years was a village of perhaps 400 inhabitants, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but large enough to support the kind of skilled craftsmen needed for the region's ongoing construction projects. Archaeological evidence suggests that the village sat along a major trade route, exposing its residents to a constant flow of travellers, news and cultural influences from across the Roman Empire. Jesus would have learned his father's trade as a tekton, developing skills in carpentry, stonework, and general construction that provided both practical training in working with his hands and metaphorical material for his future teaching. The parables and illustrations he would later use drew heavily on the world of building and craftsmanship, suggesting that these years of manual labour were not merely economic necessity, but divine preparation for communicating profound truths through familiar images. The religious education he received would have been thorough despite Nazareth's remote location. Every Jewish community, no matter how small, maintained a synagogue where the scriptures were read, discussed, and memorized. Jesus would have learned Hebrew for religious purposes while speaking Aramaic at home, and probably acquiring some Greek for commercial interactions. His later ability to quote and interpret scripture with such authority suggests years of intensive study and reflection. But something else was happening during these hidden years, something that would eventually explode onto the public stage with revolutionary force. The political and social tensions we explored earlier were not diminishing, but intensifying. Roman taxation was becoming more oppressive, religious corruption more obvious, and the gap between the wealthy elite and ordinary people more pronounced. The messianic expectations that had simmered beneath the surface of Jewish consciousness were beginning to reach a boiling point. Various movements and figures emerged during this period, each claiming to offer the solution to Israel's problems. Some preached violent revolution against Roman rule, others advocated stricter adherence to religious law, and still others promised miraculous deliverance through divine intervention. Each attracted followers, created controversy, and ultimately failed to deliver the transformation they promised. But their very existence demonstrates the intensity of the longing for change that characterized this era. The most significant of these preparatory figures was a man known as John the Baptist, who appeared in the Judean wilderness sometime around 28 or 29 AD with a message that electrified the entire region. John was not just another religious teacher or political agitator. He was a phenomenon that drew crowds from across Palestine and created a crisis of expectation that would provide the immediate context for Jesus' own emergence onto the public stage. John's message was both ancient and revolutionary. He called for repentance, a fundamental turning away from sin and toward God, but he offered this call not just to obvious sinners, but to the entire religious establishment. Tax collectors, soldiers, priests, Pharisees, ordinary farmers and fishermen all were summoned to acknowledge their need for forgiveness and to demonstrate their repentance through baptism in the Jordan River. Baptism itself was not entirely new in Jewish practice, but John's application of it was radical. Previously, baptism was primarily used for Gentile converts to Judaism, symbolizing their cleansing from pagan defilement as they entered the covenant community. But John was baptizing Jews, including religious leaders, suggesting that birth into Abraham's lineage was not sufficient for participation in God's coming kingdom. The location of John's ministry was as significant as its message. The Jordan River Valley, particularly the area near Jericho where John operated, carried profound symbolic weight in Jewish consciousness. This was where the Israelites had crossed into the Promised Land under Joshua's leadership, where the prophet Elijah had been taken up to heaven, and where Elisha had performed miraculous healings. By choosing this location, John was deliberately invoking memories of God's past interventions and suggesting that a new chapter in salvation history was about to begin. John's lifestyle reinforced his message in ways that resonated powerfully with his contemporaries. His clothing of camel hair and leather belt echoed the prophet Elijah's appearance, while his diet of locusts and wild honey demonstrated his separation from the comfortable compromises of civilized society. He was not seeking personal advancement or material gain, but living as a voice crying in the wilderness, preparing the way for someone greater than himself. The response to John's ministry was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. People came from Jerusalem, from all Judea, and from the entire region around the Jordan to hear him preach and to be baptized. This included not just the religiously curious, but also representatives of every social class and political faction. The movement became so significant that it attracted the attention of both Jewish religious authorities and Roman political leaders. The religious establishment's response to John reveals the threat they perceived in his message. When priests and Levites came from Jerusalem to question him, they weren't seeking spiritual guidance, but attempting to determine whether he represented a challenge to their authority. John's willingness to baptize anyone who showed genuine repentance, regardless of their social status or religious credentials, implicitly criticized the temple system's emphasis on ritual purity and hereditary privilege. The political implications of John's movement were equally dangerous. His preaching of a coming kingdom and his gathering of large crowds in the wilderness inevitably raised questions about sedition and rebellion. The Roman authorities had learned to be suspicious of any popular movement that combined religious fervor with messianic expectations, having already dealt with several such uprisings through military force. But John consistently deflected attempts to cast him in the role of the expected Messiah. When questioned directly about his identity, he insisted that he was merely a voice preparing the way for someone infinitely greater than himself. He spoke of one who would baptize not with water, but with the Holy Spirit and with fire, who would separate the wheat from the chaff and gather the harvest into God's storehouse. This message of preparation and expectation created exactly the right conditions for Jesus' public emergence. The entire region was primed for the appearance of the figure John had promised, and when Jesus finally stepped out of his decades of obscurity, he did so in a way that both fulfilled and transformed every expectation that had been building throughout his lifetime. The moment when Jesus approached John at the Jordan River represents one of the most pivotal transitions in human history. Here was the end of the hidden years and the beginning of a public ministry that would last only about 3 years but would reshape the world in ways that continue to reverberate today. The carpenter from Nazareth was about to become the most controversial, influential, and transformative figure in human history. But even as we approach this crucial moment, we must understand that what was about to unfold would confound every expectation, challenge every assumption, and overturn every conventional understanding of how divine power operates in human affairs. The revolution that was about to begin would be unlike anything the world had ever seen, and its effects would prove to be more lasting and far-reaching than any military conquest or political transformation in human history. The meeting between Jesus and John at the Jordan River was charged with an electricity that seemed to crackle through the very air around them. Crowds had gathered as they did every day to witness John's fiery preaching and the baptisms that followed. But something about this particular encounter felt different. The wilderness prophet, who had never shown deference to priest or ruler, who had called the Pharisees a brood of vipers and challenged tax collectors to honest dealing, suddenly found himself face to face with a figure who made him pause in recognition. John's initial reaction reveals the profound spiritual sensitivity that had made him such a powerful prophetic voice. When Jesus approached him requesting baptism, John's immediate response was to protest. This wasn't false humility or religious theatre. John recognized something in Jesus that transcended his own calling and authority. His declaration that he needed to be baptized by Jesus rather than the other way around demonstrates that he understood he was encountering the very person his entire ministry had been preparing people to receive. But Jesus' insistence on being baptized reveals a crucial aspect of his mission that would characterize everything he did throughout his public ministry. Rather than claiming exemption from the religious practices expected of ordinary people, he chose to identify completely with those he came to serve. The phrase he used to explain this decision would become a key to understanding his entire approach to ministry. He told John that they must fulfill all righteousness, suggesting that his mission involved not bypassing human religious obligation, but perfecting it. The baptism itself became a moment of cosmic significance that transformed a simple ritual into a divine revelation. As Jesus emerged from the water, the Gospel accounts describe the heavens opening and the Spirit of God descending like a dove to rest upon him. This was not merely symbolic imagery, but a visible manifestation of divine approval and empowerment that those present could witness with their own eyes. More dramatic still was the voice that spoke from heaven, declaring Jesus to be the beloved Son in whom God was well pleased. This divine pronouncement served multiple purposes in the unfolding drama. It confirmed John's recognition of Jesus' unique identity. It publicly inaugurated Jesus' ministry with unmistakable divine endorsement, and it established the theological framework that would define Christian understanding of Jesus' relationship to God for centuries to come. The impact of this event rippled through the crowds gathered at the Jordan and beyond. Word of what had happened spread rapidly throughout the region, carried by the baptized believers who returned to their homes and communities with eyewitness accounts of the supernatural phenomena they had observed. The messianic expectations that had been building throughout John's ministry suddenly had a focal point, a specific individual around whom all the hopes and prophecies could crystallize. But rather than immediately capitalizing on this moment of divine endorsement and popular excitement, Jesus made a decision that confounded every expectation of how a messianic figure should behave. Instead of gathering disciples, organizing a movement, or making public proclamations about his identity and mission, he disappeared into the wilderness for an extended period of solitude, testing, and spiritual preparation. The 40 days Jesus spent in the Judean wilderness represent one of the most psychologically and spiritually intense periods in the gospel narratives. This was not a peaceful retreat for meditation and prayer, but a fierce spiritual battle that would determine the character and direction of his entire ministry. The wilderness itself was a place of desolation and danger, inhabited by wild animals, marked by extreme temperatures, and offering little in the way of food, water, or shelter. The temptations Jesus faced during this period were not random trials, but carefully crafted challenges that struck at the very heart of his identity and mission. Each temptation represented a different model of messiahship that he could have embraced, alternative paths that would have been easier and more immediately appealing than the course he ultimately chose to follow. The first temptation addressed the most basic human need and the most obvious application of divine power. After 40 days of fasting, Jesus was physically weakened and desperately hungry. The suggestion that he turned stones into bread was not just about satisfying personal hunger, but about establishing his credentials as the kind of Messiah who would solve humanity's material problems through miraculous provision. It was the temptation to be a bread king, winning followers through economic benefits and physical comfort. Jesus' response revealed his understanding that human beings need more than material satisfaction to truly flourish. His quotation from ancient scripture about living by every word that comes from God's mouth established a hierarchy of values that would characterize his entire ministry. Physical needs were important and would be addressed, but they were not the deepest human needs or the primary focus of his mission. The second temptation was even more psychologically sophisticated, involving a dramatic relocation to the highest point of the Jerusalem temple. Here, Jesus was challenged to demonstrate his divine sonship through a spectacular public display that would force people to acknowledge his identity and submit to his authority. The suggestion was that he throw himself from the temple pinnacle, trusting God to send angels to rescue him in full view of the crowds below. This temptation was particularly clever because it used scripture to support its argument, quoting Psalms about divine protection to justify the proposed action. But Jesus recognized that this would represent a fundamental corruption of faith, turning trust in God into a manipulation of divine power for personal aggrandizement. His response indicated that testing God through presumptuous demands for miraculous intervention was not faith but its opposite. The third temptation was the most comprehensive and revealing of all. Jesus was shown all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, offered immediate control over the political and economic systems that governed human society. The price for this ultimate shortcut to global influence was simple: acknowledge the tempter's authority and worship him instead of God. This was the temptation to achieve righteous ends through unrighteous means, to establish God's kingdom through the devil's methods. It represented every form of compromise that trades moral integrity for practical effectiveness, every rationalization that justifies evil actions by appealing to good intentions. Jesus' absolute rejection of this option established the principle that would guide his entire ministry. The means must be consistent with the ends, and God's kingdom cannot be built through the world's methods of power and domination. The conclusion of the temptation period marked a crucial transition in Jesus' preparation for public ministry. The Gospel accounts note that angels came and ministered to him, providing the physical restoration he needed after his prolonged fast and spiritual battle, but more importantly, he had clarified for himself and demonstrated to the spiritual realm the kind of Messiah he intended to be, and the methods he would use to accomplish his mission. When Jesus emerged from the wilderness and began his public ministry, he did so with a clarity of purpose and a strength of character that had been forged through this period of testing. The temptations had not weakened him, but had revealed the unshakable foundation of his identity and calling. He knew who he was, what he had come to do, and what he was willing to sacrifice to accomplish it. The first phase of his ministry began in Galilee, the region where he had grown up and where his family was known. This choice was strategically significant for several reasons. Galilee was far enough from Jerusalem to allow his movement to develop without immediate interference from the religious authorities, diverse enough in its population to provide a testing ground for his universal message, and economically active enough to support a travelling ministry. The region itself was experiencing significant social and economic changes that created both opportunities and tensions. Herod Antipas was rebuilding the city of Sepphoris and constructing a new capital at Tiberias, projects that provided employment for craftsmen like Jesus, but also displaced traditional communities and created new forms of social inequality. The fishing industry on the Sea of Galilee was being commercialized through Roman taxation and regulation, transforming independent fishermen into participants in a larger economic system controlled by distant authorities. Into this environment of change and uncertainty, Jesus brought a message that was both deeply traditional and radically innovative. He began by proclaiming that the kingdom of God was near, using language that resonated with centuries of Jewish hope and expectation. But the kingdom he described was unlike any political or religious system his listeners had ever imagined. His first public appearances in Galilean synagogues created immediate controversy and excitement. The Gospel accounts describe him teaching with an authority that was qualitatively different from that of the scribes and Pharisees, who normally instructed these congregations, where they relied on citations from recognized authorities and careful interpretations of traditional texts. Jesus spoke with a directness and originality that suggested immediate access to divine truth. The reaction to his teaching was immediate and polarized. Some listeners were amazed and began following him, recognizing in his words and presence something they had never encountered before. Others were scandalized by his apparent presumption in speaking with such authority, despite his lack of formal religious credentials. The tension between these responses would characterize his entire ministry and ultimately lead to its dramatic conclusion. But it was not just his teaching that set Jesus apart from other religious figures of his time. Almost immediately, his ministry became associated with extraordinary healings and other supernatural phenomena that drew crowds from across the region and beyond. These were not the kind of gradual improvements that might be explained through natural means, but dramatic, instantaneous transformations that defied medical understanding and challenged every assumption about the relationship between the spiritual and physical realms. The healing ministry that became such a prominent feature of Jesus' work was not an end in itself, but a sign pointing to deeper realities about the nature of God's kingdom and the scope of divine compassion. Each healing was both an act of mercy toward an individual sufferer and a demonstration that the power of God was actively at work in the world, overcoming the forces of disease, disability, and death that had held humanity captive since the beginning of time. The variety and scope of these healings was unprecedented in Jewish experience. Jesus restored sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, speech to the mute, and mobility to the paralyzed. He cleansed lepers who had been excluded from normal social contact, cast out demons from those tormented by evil spirits, and even raised the dead back to life. Each category of healing addressed different aspects of human suffering, while demonstrating that no condition was beyond the reach of divine power. But perhaps even more revolutionary than the healings themselves was Jesus' approach to the people he healed. Where traditional religious practice often interpreted illness and disability as divine punishment for sin, Jesus consistently treated suffering people with compassion and dignity, refusing to blame them for their conditions while offering them hope for complete restoration. This approach inevitably brought him into conflict with religious authorities who had built their power and influence on carefully maintained boundaries between the clean and unclean, the righteous and the sinful, the acceptable and the outcast. Jesus' willingness to touch lepers, eat with tax collectors, and associate with prostitutes and other social pariahs challenged the entire social order that maintained religious respectability through systematic exclusion of undesirable elements. The calling of his first disciples provides insight into both his method of building a movement and his criteria for choosing associates. Rather than recruiting from among the religiously educated or socially prominent, Jesus selected ordinary working people whose qualifications were not their achievements, but their willingness to leave everything behind and follow him into an uncertain future. The fishermen who became his closest associates were not wealthy boat owners, but hired labourers working for others, men whose economic situation made them vulnerable to the social and political changes affecting their region. When Jesus called them to become fishers of men, he was offering them a new identity and purpose that transcended their immediate economic concerns, while utilising the skills and experiences they had already developed. The rapid growth of Jesus' following created both opportunities and problems that would shape the rest of his ministry. On one hand, the crowds that gathered to hear his teaching and witness his healings provided a platform for communicating his message across social and geographical boundaries that had previously limited religious influence. On the other hand, the very success of his ministry attracted attention from authorities who viewed any popular movement with suspicion and concern. The religious establishment's initial response to Jesus was complex and varied. Some leaders were genuinely curious about his teaching and methods, seeking private conversations to better understand his message and intentions. Others were immediately hostile, viewing him as a threat to their authority and a danger to the careful accommodations they had negotiated with Roman power. Still others adopted a wait-and-see approach, hoping that his movement would either prove harmless or destroy itself through internal contradictions. But as Jesus' influence continued to expand and his teachings became more widely known, it became increasingly clear that his message posed fundamental challenges to the existing religious and social order that could not be ignored or accommodated through minor adjustments. The kingdom, he proclaimed, was not simply a reformed version of current arrangements, but a complete transformation that would affect every aspect of human life and relationship. The parables he used to describe this kingdom were masterpieces of communication that made profound truths accessible to ordinary people while concealing them from those whose hearts were hardened against receiving them. These simple stories, drawn from everyday life in first-century Palestine, carried multiple layers of meaning that continue to yield new insights to careful students more than 2,000 years later. Through stories about farmers and fishermen, merchants and managers, kings and servants, Jesus painted a picture of reality that turned conventional wisdom upside down. In his kingdom, the first would be last and the last first. The greatest would be the servant of all, and those who lost their lives would find them. These were not merely inspiring sentiments, but descriptions of how divine power actually operates in human affairs, principles that would be demonstrated most dramatically in his own life and death. The growing crowds that followed Jesus presented both unprecedented opportunities and mounting dangers that would ultimately determine the trajectory of his ministry. As word spread throughout Palestine about the extraordinary teacher and healer from Nazareth, people began making pilgrimages from distances that required days of difficult travel. They came carrying the sick on stretchers, leading blind relatives by the hand, bringing children possessed by demons, all desperate for the healing touch that had already transformed so many lives. The sheer logistics of managing these crowds became a constant challenge. Jesus often had to escape to remote locations just to find time for prayer and rest. But even then, the multitudes would discover his whereabouts and pursue him with relentless determination. Boats became mobile platforms for teaching when the press of people on shore made communication impossible. Mountainsides served as natural amphitheatres where thousands could gather to hear words that many believed carried the authority of heaven itself. But within these enthusiastic crowds, tensions were building that reflected deeper conflicts about the nature of Jesus' mission and identity. Many who followed him were primarily interested in the material benefits his power could provide. They wanted healing for their diseases, food for their hunger, and liberation from Roman oppression. Their expectations of messiahship were shaped by centuries of political and military imagery that portrayed the coming deliverer as a conquering king who would restore Israel's earthly kingdom through supernatural force. Jesus consistently frustrated these expectations through both his words and his actions. When crowds attempted to make him king by force after he miraculously fed thousands in the wilderness, he withdrew to solitary places rather than capitalizing on their enthusiasm. When his followers began discussing which positions they would occupy in his government, he redirected their attention to service rather than status. When they suggested calling down fire from heaven to destroy hostile villages, he rebuked their vindictive spirit and led them elsewhere. This pattern of confounding popular expectations while maintaining his essential mission created a complex dynamic that kept both followers and opponents off balance. Those who came seeking earthly benefits often found themselves confronted with spiritual demands that required fundamental changes in their priorities and values. Those who expected conventional religious teaching discovered revolutionary interpretations of ancient truths that challenged their most basic assumptions about God, humanity, and the nature of righteous living. The religious authorities who initially viewed Jesus as a curious anomaly gradually recognized that his influence posed a serious threat to their carefully constructed system of beliefs and practices. His interpretation of Scripture often contradicted their traditional teachings, his healing activities violated their Sabbath regulations, and his association with social outcasts undermined their emphasis on ritual purity and moral separation. More troubling still was his apparent claim to possess authority that belonged exclusively to God. The controversy over Sabbath observance became a particular flashpoint that illustrated the fundamental differences between Jesus' approach to religious law and that of the established religious leadership. When his disciples picked grain while walking through fields on the Sabbath, or when he healed people on the day designated for rest, he was not simply breaking minor regulations, but challenging the entire interpretive framework that governed Jewish religious life. His declaration that the Sabbath was made for humanity rather than humanity for the Sabbath represented a revolutionary reversal of priorities that placed human need above institutional requirements. His claim that he was Lord of the Sabbath went even further, asserting personal authority over one of the most sacred institutions in Jewish religion. These were not the words of a reform-minded teacher seeking to improve existing practices, but of someone claiming divine prerogatives that no mere human being could legitimately possess. The healings that had initially attracted such positive attention also became sources of controversy as religious leaders struggled to explain phenomena that clearly exceeded natural capabilities. Unable to deny the reality of the miraculous events that were witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people, some critics resorted to accusations that Jesus was accomplishing these works through demonic rather than divine power. This charge was particularly serious because it attempted to transform his greatest evidence of divine approval into proof of spiritual corruption. Jesus' response to these accusations revealed both his logical acuity and his understanding of the spiritual warfare underlying the visible conflicts. His argument that a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand exposed the fundamental contradiction in claiming that Satan would cast out Satan. His warning about blasphemy against the Holy Spirit indicated that there were lines of opposition to divine truth that, once crossed, placed individuals beyond the reach of forgiveness and restoration. The selection and training of 12 particular disciples from among his larger following marked a crucial phase in the development of his movement. These men, drawn from diverse backgrounds and representing different temperaments and skills, would become the foundation for continuing his mission after his departure. The number 12 was symbolically significant, representing the tribes of Israel and suggesting that Jesus was reconstituting the covenant community around new principles and purposes. The training these disciples received was unlike any educational program in the ancient world. Rather than studying in classrooms or memorizing traditional texts, they learned through constant observation of their master's methods and gradual participation in his ministry activities. They watched him handle hostile questioners, comfort grieving families, challenge religious hypocrites, and demonstrate divine power in ways that defied human understanding. They listened to his private explanations of public teachings, witnessed his personal prayer life, and slowly began to grasp the magnitude of what they had committed themselves to follow. But their education was not merely observational. Jesus began sending them out in pairs to engage in ministry activities on their own, providing them with specific instructions about how to conduct themselves and what message to proclaim. These missionary journeys served as practical training exercises that tested their faith, developed their confidence, and extended the reach of the kingdom message beyond what Jesus could accomplish through his personal presence alone. The reports they brought back from these missions revealed both the power available to those who operated under divine authority and the mixed reception such ministry would inevitably receive. Some communities welcomed them eagerly, providing hospitality and responding positively to their message. Others rejected them completely, forcing them to move on without accomplishing their intended purpose. These varied responses prepared them for the broader pattern of acceptance and rejection that would characterize the expansion of the Christian movement in subsequent decades. As Jesus' ministry progressed into its second year, the opposition he faced became more organized and sophisticated. Religious leaders from Jerusalem began making regular trips to Galilee to observe his activities and challenge his teachings. They sent representatives to infiltrate his crowds and ask questions designed to trap him in statements that could be used as evidence of heresy or sedition. They formed alliances with political authorities who shared their concerns about the potential for popular unrest associated with messianic movements. The nature of these challenges reveals the intellectual and spiritual caliber of Jesus' opponents. These were not ignorant or unintelligent men, but highly educated religious professionals who understood both Jewish law and Roman political realities with sophisticated precision. Their questions about taxation, marriage, resurrection, and the greatest commandment were carefully crafted to force Jesus into positions that would either alienate his popular following or provide grounds for legal action against him. Jesus' responses to these verbal duels demonstrated a mastery of both scripture and logic that consistently frustrated his opponents' attempts to discredit him. His ability to turn their questions back on themselves, to expose the hidden assumptions behind their challenges, and to provide answers that satisfied both divine truth and human reason, established his reputation as a teacher whose wisdom transcended conventional learning. These exchanges, recorded in the Gospel narratives, became foundational texts for Christian theology and apologetics. But the conflicts were not merely intellectual exercises. Behind the theological debates lay fundamental disagreements about the nature of divine authority, the requirements of righteous living, and the destiny of the Jewish people. Jesus' claim to forgive sins, his assertion that salvation came through faith rather than works, and his prediction that the temple would be destroyed all challenged core beliefs that had sustained Jewish identity through centuries of persecution and exile. The growing tension between Jesus and the religious establishment created an increasingly dangerous situation that required careful navigation. His popularity with common people provided some protection against direct action by his opponents, but it also increased their determination to find ways to neutralize his influence. The delicate balance of power that maintained relative stability in Roman Palestine could not indefinitely sustain the kind of religious and social upheaval that Jesus' ministry was producing. The decision to make a final journey to Jerusalem for Passover represented a crucial turning point that would transform the nature of Jesus' ministry from regional phenomenon to cosmic event. This was not simply another teaching tour, but a deliberate confrontation with the center of Jewish religious authority at the most symbolically significant moment in the religious calendar. Everything that had been building throughout his Galilean ministry would reach its climax in the holy city during the festival that commemorated God's greatest act of liberation in Jewish history. The journey itself became a final intensive training period for his disciples, as Jesus used the time to prepare them for events that would test their faith beyond anything they had previously experienced. His predictions about his coming suffering and death confused and disturbed them because they conflicted with their expectations of messianic triumph. His teachings about servant leadership and sacrificial love challenged their assumptions about the rewards that awaited those who had given up everything to follow him. As the traveling company made its way through the Jordan Valley toward Jerusalem, crowds of Passover pilgrims joined the procession, swelling their numbers and increasing the excitement that surrounded Jesus' approach to the capital city. Many of these fellow travelers had heard reports of his ministry and were eager to witness firsthand the works and words that had created such controversy throughout Palestine. Others were simply caught up in the festive atmosphere that always accompanied major religious festivals. The final approach to Jerusalem created a moment of dramatic tension that crystallized all the hopes, fears, and expectations that had been building throughout Jesus' ministry. As the city came into view across the Kidron Valley, with the temple complex gleaming in the afternoon sun and pilgrims streaming through the gates, everyone present understood that they were approaching a moment of destiny that would determine not just the fate of one remarkable individual, but the future direction of God's relationship with humanity. The events that would unfold during that final week in Jerusalem would surpass in their significance and consequence anything that had happened during the previous 3 years of public ministry. The carpenter from Nazareth, who had emerged from obscurity beside the Jordan River, was about to engage in a final confrontation with the powers of this world that would demonstrate, once and for all, whether the kingdom he proclaimed was merely human wishful thinking or divine reality breaking into history with transformative power. But even as that climactic week approached, those closest to Jesus remained unprepared for the revolution that was about to unfold. A revolution that would be accomplished not through the methods they expected, but through a demonstration of divine love, so radical and complete that it would forever change humanity's understanding of what it means for God to intervene in human affairs. The crowds that gathered around Jesus as he approached Jerusalem for that final Passover created an atmosphere unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Word had spread throughout the pilgrim caravans about the Galilean teacher, whose very presence seemed to bend reality itself. Merchants closing their stents whispered about blind men receiving sight. Fishermen mending nets debated whether anyone could truly raise the dead. And mothers carrying children spoke in hushed tones about a kingdom where the last would be first. But Jerusalem was not Galilee. The holy city represented the concentrated power of everything Jesus had spent 3 years challenging. Here the temple priests conducted their elaborate rituals with meticulous precision, collecting tribute from every corner of the Jewish world. Here the Sanhedrin debated points of law that could determine life or death. Here Roman governors balanced imperial demands against local sensibilities with the constant awareness that any miscalculation could trigger rebellion. As Jesus' procession crested the Mount of Olives and the full panorama of Jerusalem spread before them, something extraordinary happened that revealed the true nature of what was unfolding. The crowds that had been following began to erupt in celebration, laying their cloaks on the road and cutting palm branches to wave in the air. Their shouts filled the valley with declarations that this was the Son of David, the one who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel, who would restore the kingdom to its former glory. This was not spontaneous enthusiasm, but the fulfillment of ancient prophecies that had been waiting centuries for their moment of realization. The image of a king riding into Jerusalem on a donkey had been painted by the prophet Zechariah in words that every educated Jew could recite from memory. Yet Jesus' choice to fulfill this prophecy in such a literal and public way represented a calculated decision to force a confrontation that could no longer be avoided or postponed. The religious authorities watching from the city walls understood immediately what was happening. This was not merely another popular teacher entering Jerusalem for the festival. This was a direct challenge to their authority, presented in terms that left no room for neutral interpretation. Either Jesus was indeed the promised Messiah with a legitimate claim to David's throne, or he was a dangerous impostor whose pretensions threatened the delicate peace that kept their nation from Roman destruction. The political implications were equally explosive. Pilate, the Roman governor, had travelled up from Caesarea specifically to maintain order during Passover, bringing additional troops to supplement the regular garrison. Any hint of messianic uprising during the festival could trigger the kind of brutal suppression that had already devastated other regions of the empire. The stakes could not have been higher for everyone involved. Jesus' first action upon entering the city revealed the radical nature of his mission and the futility of expecting him to conform to conventional political categories. Rather than proceeding to the palace or the fortress to stake his claim to earthly power, he went directly to the temple complex and began overturning the tables of money changers and driving out those who were buying and selling in the sacred precincts. This was not random vandalism, but a carefully targeted assault on the commercialization of worship that had transformed the house of prayer into what Jesus called a den of thieves. The temple courts had become a marketplace where religious obligation was monetized where access to God was mediated through economic transactions, and where the poor were systematically excluded from full participation in the spiritual life of their community. The scene that unfolded was unlike anything in the temple's history. Coins scattered across the marble floors, animals freed from their cages fled in all directions, and merchants who had grown wealthy from pilgrim desperation found their entire business model under assault from someone who claimed authority over the sacred space itself. The sound of overturning tables echoed through the vast courtyards like thunder announcing an approaching storm. But even more shocking than the physical disruption was the theological claim implicit in Jesus' actions. By cleansing the temple, he was asserting authority over the most sacred institution in Jewish religion, positioning himself as the final arbiter of proper worship, and declaring that the current system had failed so completely that only radical intervention could restore its intended purpose. The response from the religious establishment was swift and unified in its hostility. Chief priests, scribes, and elders, who normally competed for influence, found themselves allied in opposition to someone who threatened their collective power structure. They began immediately plotting how to eliminate this troublemaker without triggering the popular uprising that his arrest might provoke. Yet Jesus did not retreat or moderate his message in response to their opposition. Instead, he spent the remaining days of that week teaching in the temple courts with an intensity and directness that surpassed anything from his earlier ministry. The parables he told during this period were not gentle stories about seeds and sheep, but devastating critiques of religious hypocrisy and warnings about coming judgment that left no doubt about his assessment of the current spiritual condition of God's people. The parable of the wicked tenants was particularly inflammatory because it cast the religious leaders as murderers who had killed the prophets sent to them and were now preparing to kill the owner's son in order to steal his inheritance. Everyone listening understood that Jesus was identifying himself as that son and predicting his own death at their hands, while simultaneously claiming divine authority that made their opposition not just misguided, but cosmically rebellious. His teachings during this final week also revealed the full scope of his mission in ways that had only been hinted at during his Galilean ministry. He spoke openly about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, events that would vindicate his warnings, while demonstrating that God's presence was not confined to buildings made by human hands. He described his own death and resurrection using imagery that connected his personal destiny to the salvation of the entire world. The discourse about the end times that he delivered to his disciples on the Mount of Olives painted a picture of cosmic upheaval that would precede the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. Wars, famines, earthquakes, and persecutions would mark the birth pangs of a new age in which the Son of Man would return with power and glory to judge the living and the dead. This was not merely Jewish restoration, but universal transformation that would affect every nation and people. The religious authorities recognized that they were running out of time to act before Jesus' influence became too powerful to contain. The crowds that gathered daily to hear his teaching were growing larger and more enthusiastic. Pilgrims were returning to their home countries carrying reports of his words and works, and even some members of the Sanhedrin were beginning to express doubts about the wisdom of opposing him. Their solution came through one of Jesus' own disciples, a man named Judas Iscariot, who approached them with an offer to betray his master for 30 pieces of silver. The motivation behind this betrayal remains one of history's great mysteries. Whether it was simple greed, political disappointment, or some misguided attempt to force Jesus into revealing his true power by placing him in mortal danger. The timing of Judas's offer coincided with Jesus' own preparations for what he knew would be his final meal with the disciples who had shared his ministry for 3 years. The Passover celebration he arranged in an upper room in Jerusalem became the setting for teachings and symbolic actions that would define Christian worship for millennia to come, while providing his followers with resources for understanding the traumatic events that were about to unfold. The meal itself was laden with significance that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. As a traditional Passover celebration, it commemorated the Israelites' liberation from Egyptian bondage and looked forward to the ultimate deliverance that God had promised his people. As Jesus' final discourse to his disciples, it provided crucial instruction about the nature of his mission and their role in continuing it after his departure. As the institution of what would become known as communion or the Lord's Supper, it established a ritual that would connect future generations of believers to the central events of salvation history. But perhaps most remarkably, it was during this meal that Jesus demonstrated the kind of leadership that would characterize his kingdom by washing his disciples' feet, performing the task of the lowliest servant while wearing the authority of the highest master. This acted parable embodied everything he had been teaching about greatness through service, power through humility, and the complete reversal of worldly values that his kingdom represented. The conversations that took place during and after this meal revealed the psychological and spiritual preparation Jesus was providing for disciples who were about to face the greatest test of their lives. His prediction of Peter's denial, his warning about coming persecution, his promise of the Holy Spirit's presence, and his prayer for their unity all demonstrated his awareness of what lay ahead and his determination to equip them for survival and eventual triumph. As the evening progressed and they moved from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane, the full weight of what Jesus was about to endure began to manifest itself in ways that revealed both his complete humanity and his unwavering commitment to his mission. The agony he experienced in that garden, sweating drops of blood while wrestling with the prospect of bearing the sins of the world, showed that his sacrifice would be no mere theatrical performance, but a genuine confrontation with the deepest realities of evil and death. The disciples who had boasted of their loyalty and readiness to die with their master proved incapable of even staying awake during his hour of greatest need. Their failure in this moment of testing foreshadowed the more complete abandonment that would follow when the forces arrayed against Jesus finally moved to arrest him. The arrival of Judas leading a contingent of temple guards and Roman soldiers marked the beginning of a sequence of events that would unfold with inexorable momentum toward a conclusion that would determine not just Jesus' fate, but the destiny of the human race. The kiss of betrayal, the brief scuffle as Peter drew his sword, Jesus' healing of the wounded guard, and his voluntary surrender to his captors all demonstrated that even in this moment of apparent defeat, he remained in control of circumstances that seemed to be spiraling beyond anyone's ability to manage. The trials that followed represented a travesty of justice that exposed the corruption and desperation of both religious and political authorities who found themselves forced to manufacture charges against someone whose only crime was claiming to be who he actually was. The religious trial before the Sanhedrin violated numerous procedural requirements of Jewish law, while the political trial before Pilate revealed the Roman governor's awareness that he was being manipulated into executing an innocent man for the sake of maintaining civil order. Yet through all these proceedings, Jesus maintained a dignity and composure that confounded his accusers and revealed the true nature of the confrontation taking place. This was not merely a clash between competing human authorities, but a cosmic battle between the kingdom of God and the principalities and powers that had held humanity captive since the beginning of time. The crucifixion itself represented the climax of human evil and divine love, intersecting in a moment that would forever change the relationship between heaven and earth. The method of execution that Rome reserved for the lowest criminals and most dangerous revolutionaries became the means by which the creator of the universe demonstrated the lengths to which divine love would go to reconcile rebellious humanity to himself. But even as Jesus hung dying on that Roman cross outside Jerusalem's walls, forces were already at work that would transform apparent defeat into ultimate victory and turn a moment of despair into the foundation for humanity's greatest hope. The physical suffering that Jesus endured during those final hours was beyond human comprehension, yet it was only the visible manifestation of something far more profound taking place in the spiritual realm. As he hung suspended between heaven and earth, darkness covered the land in the middle of the day, as if creation itself was responding to the cosmic significance of what was unfolding on that crude wooden instrument of torture. The words Jesus spoke from the cross revealed the multiple dimensions of his suffering and the various audiences he was addressing even in his agony. His prayer for forgiveness for those who were crucifying him demonstrated that his mission of reconciliation extended even to his executioners. His promise to the repentant thief crucified beside him showed that salvation was available until the very last moment of life. His provision for his mother's care revealed that even divine mission did not override human responsibility and family obligation. But it was his cry of abandonment that penetrated to the very heart of what was happening in that moment. When Jesus called out asking why God had forsaken him, he was experiencing the full weight of human sin and divine judgment in ways that no other person could ever endure. The separation from his Father that he experienced was not merely emotional or psychological, but represented the actual bearing of humanity's guilt and the payment of sin's ultimate price. The centurion who supervised the execution, a hardened Roman soldier who had witnessed countless crucifixions, recognized that something unprecedented was taking place before his eyes. His declaration that this man was truly the Son of God represented the first Gentile confession of Jesus' identity and foreshadowed the global expansion of the movement that would follow his death and resurrection. The moment when Jesus declared that his mission was finished and voluntarily surrendered, his spirit marked the completion of the most important work ever undertaken in human history. The temple veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary was torn from top to bottom, symbolizing that the barrier between God and humanity had been permanently removed. Earthquakes shook the region, graves were opened, and the dead were raised, demonstrating that the power of death itself had been broken. Yet to the casual observer watching these events unfold, it appeared that another messianic pretender had been eliminated by the efficient machinery of Roman justice. The disciples who had followed Jesus for 3 years fled in terror and confusion, convinced that their hopes had been crushed along with their master's broken body. The religious authorities who had orchestrated his execution congratulated themselves on removing a dangerous threat to social stability. The wealthy member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea, who requested Jesus' body for burial, was performing what seemed to be a final act of compassion for a failed revolutionary. The tomb he provided was new and expensive, carved from solid rock and sealed with a massive stone that required several men to move. The Roman guard posted to prevent grave robbing was a standard precaution against disciples attempting to steal the body and claim their master had risen from the dead. The women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and witnessed his crucifixion prepared spices and perfumes to complete the burial process that had been interrupted by the onset of the Sabbath. Their plans to return to the tomb after the day of rest to anoint his body represented their acceptance that death had ended their association with the one they had believed was the Messiah. They were coming not to witness a resurrection, but to perform the final rituals of mourning. But the tomb that had been sealed on Friday evening was empty when they arrived on Sunday morning, and the implications of that empty tomb would reverberate through history with more transformative power than any military conquest or political revolution. The stone had been rolled away, not to let Jesus out, but to let the witnesses in, to provide undeniable evidence that death had been conquered and that everything Jesus had taught about himself and his mission had been vindicated by divine power. The appearances of the risen Jesus to his disciples over the following weeks were not ghostly visitations or psychological hallucinations, but physical encounters with someone who had genuinely returned from death while retaining both his humanity and his divine nature. He ate with them, allowed them to touch his wounds, and demonstrated that resurrection was not merely spiritual survival, but the complete restoration of human life, in a perfected form that transcended the limitations of mortality. The transformation these encounters produced in his followers was immediate and dramatic. The same disciples who had fled in terror when their master was arrested became fearless proclaimers of his resurrection, willing to face imprisonment, torture, and death rather than deny what they had witnessed. The psychological impossibility of this change, apart from genuine supernatural intervention, has been recognized by historians regardless of their personal religious convictions. Peter, who had denied even knowing Jesus when challenged by a servant girl during the trials, became the bold spokesman who accused the religious authorities of murdering the Messiah while proclaiming that God had raised him from the dead. The fisherman who had cowered before human threats now stood before the same Sanhedrin that had condemned Jesus and declared that salvation could be found in no other name under heaven. The commissioning Jesus gave to his disciples before his final departure established the framework for what would become the most successful expansion movement in human history. The command to make disciples of all nations represented a radical departure from Jewish particularism and set in motion a process that would eventually carry the Christian message to every corner of the inhabited world. The promise of the Holy Spirit's empowerment that accompanied this commission was fulfilled dramatically on the day of Pentecost, when supernatural phenomena accompanied the disciples' first major public proclamation of the resurrection message. The ability to speak in foreign languages they had never learned enabled them to communicate with Jewish pilgrims from across the Roman Empire, while the boldness and clarity of their message convinced thousands that Jesus was indeed the promised Messiah. The early Christian community that emerged in Jerusalem following these events embodied many of the kingdom principles Jesus had taught during his ministry. They shared their possessions freely, cared for one another's needs, and demonstrated a quality of life that attracted others to join their movement. Their worship combined Jewish traditions with new practices centered on celebrating Jesus' death and resurrection. But the expansion of Christianity beyond its Jewish origins required another dramatic divine intervention through the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee who had been one of the movement's most violent persecutors. The encounter with the risen Jesus that transformed Saul into Paul the Apostle demonstrated that the resurrection was not merely a past historical event, but a continuing reality that could interrupt and redirect human lives in the present. Paul's missionary journeys carried the Christian message throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, establishing churches in major urban centers and developing the theological framework that would define Christian doctrine for centuries to come. His letters to these churches, written to address specific practical and doctrinal issues, became foundational documents that explained how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection provided the solution to humanity's deepest spiritual needs. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple in 70 AD, exactly as Jesus had predicted, vindicated his warnings while forcing Christianity to define itself independently of Jewish nationalism and temple worship. The movement that had begun as a Jewish sect claiming that Jesus was the promised Messiah evolved into a universal religion that offered salvation to people of every race, culture, and social condition. The speed with which Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, despite official persecution and social opposition, demonstrated the power of the resurrection message to transform individual lives and entire communities. Within 3 centuries of Jesus' death, the movement he had founded became the official religion of the empire that had executed him, proving that divine power operates according to principles completely different from human assumptions about influence and authority. The theological developments that occurred during the first few centuries of Christian history represented attempts to understand and articulate the implications of Jesus' life and work for human understanding of God, salvation, and eternal destiny. The councils that formulated the major creeds were not creating new doctrines, but clarifying what had been implicit in the original apostolic message about Jesus' identity as both fully human and fully divine. The monasticism that emerged as Christianity became socially acceptable represented an attempt to preserve the radical discipleship that had characterized the earliest Christian communities. Monks and nuns who withdrew from worldly pursuits to focus entirely on spiritual development maintained the tradition of sacrificial commitment that Jesus had demanded from his closest followers. The development of Christian art, architecture, music, and literature created new forms of cultural expression that reflected the transformation of human consciousness produced by the resurrection message. Cathedrals that reached toward heaven, paintings that depicted biblical narratives, and musical compositions that celebrated divine themes all testified to the continuing influence of Jesus' life on human creativity and imagination. The missionary expansion that carried Christianity to every continent demonstrated the universal appeal of a message that promised forgiveness, purpose, and eternal hope to people regardless of their cultural background or personal history. The translation of the Bible into hundreds of languages made Jesus' teachings accessible to societies that had never heard of Palestine or Rome. But perhaps the most significant evidence of Jesus' continuing influence has been the social transformation that has occurred wherever his teachings have been seriously applied. The abolition of slavery, the establishment of hospitals and schools, the development of human rights concepts, and countless other improvements in human welfare can be traced directly to principles that Jesus taught and embodied during his brief earthly ministry. The calendar system that dates events from his birth, the weekly cycle that reserves Sunday for worship and rest, the holidays that commemorate events from his life, and the moral standards that continue to shape legal systems worldwide, all demonstrate that the carpenter from Nazareth achieved a kind of influence that no political ruler or military conqueror has ever matched. Yet the ultimate significance of Jesus' life cannot be measured through historical analysis or cultural impact, but only through personal encounter with the risen Christ who continues to transform individual lives in the present day. The same power that raised him from the dead remains available to anyone willing to acknowledge their need for forgiveness and accept the salvation he provided through his sacrificial death. The story that began in an obscure Palestinian village 2,000 years ago continues to unfold today as people around the world discover that the claims Jesus made about himself were not the delusions of a religious fanatic, but the truth about reality itself. The kingdom he proclaimed was not a failed political movement, but an eternal spiritual reality that transcends all human institutions while working through them to accomplish divine purposes. The complete life of Jesus Christ thus extends far beyond the historical boundaries of his earthly existence to encompass every person who has found in him the answer to humanity's deepest questions about meaning, purpose, and destiny. His influence continues to grow because his message addresses needs that remain constant across all cultural and historical boundaries, offering hope that is both deeply personal and universally relevant. The centuries that followed Jesus' resurrection witnessed an extraordinary phenomenon that defied every conventional understanding of how influence spreads through human societies. While empires rose and fell through military conquest and political manipulation, the message of a crucified carpenter continued expanding through the most unlikely methods imaginable. Instead of armies, it spread through fishermen and tent makers. Instead of royal decrees, it advanced through personal testimonies. Instead of forced conversion, it grew through voluntary transformation. The persecution that erupted against early Christians seemed designed to crush this movement before it could gain momentum. Emperor Nero used Christians as human torches to illuminate his gardens, while others were thrown to wild beasts in the Colosseum for the entertainment of bloodthirsty crowds. Yet each martyrdom only seemed to strengthen the resolve of other believers and attract new converts who marveled at the courage and peace displayed by those facing death. The writings that emerged during this period of intense opposition reveal the psychological and spiritual resources that enabled ordinary people to endure extraordinary suffering. The letters attributed to apostles like Peter, James, and John provided practical guidance for living faithfully in hostile environments while maintaining hope for ultimate vindication. These documents became treasured possessions in Christian communities scattered across the Mediterranean world. The theological questions that arose as Christianity encountered Greek philosophy and Roman law required sophisticated intellectual responses that demonstrated the compatibility of faith and reason. Early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr and Origen engaged with the finest minds of their era, showing that belief in Jesus' resurrection was not intellectual suicide, but the most rational response to the evidence of his life and continuing influence. The diversity of cultures that embraced Christianity created challenges and opportunities that nobody had anticipated when the movement began in Jerusalem. Syrian Christians developed different worship practices than their Egyptian counterparts, while believers in Rome faced political pressures unknown to those in rural Anatolia. Yet the essential message remained consistent across these varied contexts, suggesting that its appeal transcended cultural boundaries. The role of women in preserving and transmitting Christian teaching became increasingly apparent as historians examined the archaeological evidence from early Christian sites. Despite official restrictions on female participation in public religious activities, women served as teachers, financial supporters, and even leaders in many Christian communities. Their contributions were essential to the movement's survival and growth during its most vulnerable period. The economic implications of Christian growth began affecting entire regions as converts withdrew from trades associated with pagan religious practices. Silversmiths, who crafted idols, found their businesses declining, while temple prostitutes sought alternative employment. These economic disruptions created additional sources of opposition while demonstrating the practical consequences of genuine religious conversion. The educational revolution that accompanied Christianity's expansion transformed how knowledge was preserved and transmitted throughout the ancient world. Christian schools established alongside churches provided literacy training for ordinary people who had previously been excluded from formal education. The copying and distribution of biblical texts created networks of communication that operated independently of official governmental channels. The architectural innovations that emerged as Christian communities constructed permanent meeting places reflected both theological convictions and practical necessities. The basilica design that became standard for church buildings symbolized the democratic nature of Christian worship, while providing acoustic properties that allowed large congregations to participate in communal singing and responsive readings. The calendar reforms that gradually replaced pagan festivals with Christian celebrations represented a systematic attempt to reshape how entire populations understood the rhythm of time itself. Christmas and Easter became focal points for community celebration that reinforced biblical narratives while creating economic opportunities for merchants and craftsmen who provided goods and services for these occasions. The legal protections that Christians eventually secured through persistent advocacy and political maneuvering established precedents for religious freedom that would influence governmental policies for centuries to come. The Edict of Milan, issued by Emperor Constantine in 313 AD, marked a crucial turning point that transformed Christianity from a persecuted sect into a legally recognized religion with rights and privileges. The intellectual synthesis that occurred when Christian theologians engaged seriously with classical philosophy produced new forms of thinking that enriched both traditions. The writings of Augustine of Hippo demonstrated how Platonic concepts could illuminate biblical truths, while the works of Thomas Aquinas showed how Aristotelian logic could support Christian doctrine without compromising its essential character. The missionary movements that carried Christianity beyond the borders of the Roman Empire revealed the universal appeal of Jesus' message across racial and cultural boundaries that had previously seemed insurmountable. Celtic missionaries reached Ireland and Scotland, while Nestorian Christians established churches as far east as China and India. Each of these expansions required adaptation to local customs while maintaining fidelity to core Christian principles. The monastic communities that flourished during the medieval period preserved classical learning and biblical scholarship through centuries of political upheaval and social chaos. Monasteries became centers of education, healthcare, and agricultural innovation that benefited entire regions while maintaining the spiritual disciplines that Jesus had exemplified during his earthly ministry. The artistic achievements that emerged from Christian inspiration created new forms of beauty that continue to inspire admiration centuries later. Gothic cathedrals reaching toward heaven, illuminated manuscripts preserving biblical narratives, and musical compositions celebrating divine themes all testified to the creative energy unleashed when human talent was dedicated to expressing spiritual truth. The social reforms that Christian activists championed throughout history demonstrated the practical implications of taking Jesus' teachings seriously in addressing systemic injustices. The abolition of slavery, the establishment of hospitals for the poor, the creation of educational opportunities for marginalized populations, and countless other humanitarian initiatives can be traced directly to principles that Jesus taught and embodied. The scientific revolution that transformed human understanding of the natural world was significantly advanced by Christians who believed that studying creation was a form of worship that revealed the character and methods of the Creator. Figures like Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, and Gregor Mendel made foundational discoveries while maintaining that their scientific work was motivated by religious conviction rather than secular curiosity. The democratic movements that challenged absolute monarchy and established representative government drew heavily on Christian concepts of human dignity and moral equality that had been largely absent from classical political theory. The idea that government derives its authority from the consent of the governed reflected theological convictions about the value of individual conscience and the accountability of rulers to divine justice. The humanitarian organizations that respond to natural disasters, provide medical care in underserved regions, and advocate for human rights around the world continue the tradition of practical compassion that Jesus demonstrated during his earthly ministry. These modern expressions of ancient principles show how his influence continues to motivate sacrificial service in contemporary contexts. The translation projects that have made biblical texts available in thousands of languages represent one of the largest collaborative intellectual undertakings in human history. The linguistic research required for accurate translation has advanced understanding of communication itself, while making Jesus' teachings accessible to people groups that were previously isolated from global cultural exchanges. The technological innovations that have accelerated the spread of Christian teaching demonstrate how each generation finds new methods for accomplishing the commission that Jesus gave to his disciples. Radio broadcasts, television programs, internet resources, and mobile applications now carry his message to audiences that earlier missionaries could never have reached through traditional methods. The interfaith dialogue that has developed as Christianity encountered other world religions has produced deeper understanding of both commonalities and differences in human spiritual experience. These conversations have clarified distinctive Christian claims, while fostering mutual respect among people of different religious convictions who share common concerns about meaning, morality, and transcendence. The ongoing scholarly research that continues to investigate the historical foundations of Christianity has generally strengthened rather than weakened the case for the reliability of the gospel accounts. Archaeological discoveries, textual analysis, and comparative studies have provided additional evidence for the accuracy of biblical narratives, while illuminating the cultural context that shaped Jesus' ministry. The personal testimonies that continue to emerge from people whose lives have been transformed through encounter with Jesus demonstrate that his influence transcends historical analysis and cultural observation. Former drug addicts who find freedom from addiction, broken families that experience reconciliation, and individuals who discover purpose after years of despair all provide contemporary evidence of the same transformative power that characterized his original ministry. The global perspective that modern communication has made possible reveals the truly worldwide scope of Christianity's influence in ways that previous generations could never have appreciated. Believers worshipping simultaneously in thousands of different languages, facing persecution in some regions while enjoying freedom in others, yet united by common faith in the risen Christ, fulfill the vision of universal discipleship that Jesus articulated before his ascension. The enduring questions that each generation must answer about Jesus' identity and claims ensure that his influence will continue as long as human beings seek meaning beyond material existence. Whether approached through historical investigation, philosophical analysis, or personal experience, the figure of Jesus continues to challenge assumptions, provoke discussion, and demand responses that shape individual lives and entire civilizations. The story that began with a young woman's acceptance of an impossible pregnancy and continued through a carpenter's emergence from obscurity to transform the ancient world remains unfinished because its ultimate chapter depends on choices yet to be made by people yet to be born. The complete life of Jesus Christ extends beyond historical boundaries to encompass every person who encounters his claims and must decide whether they represent human delusion or divine truth breaking into human experience with eternal consequences. So here we stand, more than 2,000 years after a carpenter's son took his first breath in an obscure Palestinian village, and the question that began this journey remains as urgent today as it was for those first witnesses who watched an empty tomb shatter every assumption about the finality of death. We've traced the arc of a life that split history itself, following the thread from Bethlehem's humble stable to Jerusalem's brutal cross, from a sealed tomb to a resurrection that launched the most transformative movement in human history. But this isn't just ancient history we've been exploring. This is the story that continues to unfold every time someone encounters the same choice that confronted those first disciples, the same decision that has echoed through every generation since that Sunday morning when everything changed. The carpenter from Nazareth, who confounded every expectation of how divine power should operate in human affairs, refuses to remain safely contained within the boundaries of historical analysis or cultural observation. His influence didn't end with the closing of the biblical canon or the establishment of institutional Christianity. It continues today in every life transformed by the same power that raised him from the dead, in every act of sacrificial love that reflects his character, in every moment when ordinary people discover that the claims he made about himself are not the echoes of ancient superstition, but the truth about reality itself. The complete life of Jesus Christ ultimately isn't complete until each of us decides what we'll do with the evidence we've encountered, the testimony we've heard, and the invitation that still stands open to anyone willing to acknowledge that the deepest questions of human existence find their answer not in human wisdom or achievement, but in the person who declared himself to be the way, the truth, and the life.